Good evening. I'd like to read about space now. Just relax. I'm uploading video, but I don't like to wait. It's 6 p.m. I have uploaded like 40 videos today. All these aircrafts. So I just like to read this and relax. And not talking. I don't like to talk now. I'm tired and it's very hot.
Space Shuttle. This article is about a spacecraft system used by NASA. For space shuttles in general, see spacecraft and spaceplane. For the spaceplane component of the Space Shuttle, see Space Shuttle Orbiter. The Space Shuttle is a retired, partially reusable low-Earth orbital spacecraft system operated from 1981 to 2011 by the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, as part of the Space Shuttle program. Its official program name was Space Transportation System, STS, taken from a 1969 plan for a system of reusable spacecraft where it was the only item funded for development. The first, STS-1, of 4 orbital test flights occurred in 1981, leading to operational flights, STS-5, beginning in 1982. 5 complete Space Shuttle orbiter vehicles were built and flown on a total of 135 missions from 1981 to 2011. They launched from the Kennedy Space Center, KSC, in Florida. Operational missions launched numerous satellites, interplanetary probes, and the Hubble Space Telescope, HST, conducted science experiments in orbit, participated in the Shuttle Mir program with Russia, and participated in the construction and servicing of the International Space Station, ISS. The Space Shuttle fleet's total mission time was 1,323 days. Space Shuttle components include the orbiter vehicle, with 3 clustered rocket Dyna S-25 main engines, a pair of recoverable solid rocket boosters, SRBs, and the expendable external tank, ET, containing liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The Space Shuttle was launched vertically, like a conventional rocket, with the 2 SRBs operating in parallel with the orbiter's 3 main engines, which were fueled from the ET. The SRBs were jettisoned before the vehicle reached orbit, while the main engines continued to operate, and the ET was jettisoned after main engine Q-TAF and just before orbit insertion, which used the orbiter's 2 orbital maneuvering system, OMS, engines. At the conclusion of the mission, the orbiter fired its OMS to deorbit and re-enter the atmosphere. The orbiter was protected during re-entry by its thermal protection system tiles, and it glided as a spaceplane to a runway landing, usually to the shuttle landing facility at KSC, Florida, or to Rogers Dry Lake in Edwards Air Force Base, California. If the landing occurred at Edwards, the orbiter was flown back to the KSC atop the Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, SCA, a specially modified Boeing 747 designed to carry the shuttle above it. The first orbiter, Enterprise, was built in 1976 and used in approach and landing tests, ORT, but had no orbital capability. 4 fully operational orbiters were initially built: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis. Of these, 2 were lost in mission accidents, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, with a total of 14 astronauts killed. A fifth operational, and sixth in total, orbiter, Endeavour, was built in 1991 to replace Challenger. The three surviving operational vehicles were retired from service following Atlantis's final flight on the 21st of July 2011. The US relied on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft to transport astronauts to the ISS from the last shuttle flight until the launch of the Crew Dragon Demo 2 mission in May 2020. Design and development, edit. Historical background, edit. In the late 1930s, the German government launched the America Bomber project, and Eugen Singer's idea, together with mathematician Irene Bredt, was a winged rocket called the Silbervogel, German for silver bird. During the 1950s, the United States Air Force proposed using a reusable piloted glider to perform military operations such as reconnaissance, satellite attack, and air-to-ground weapons employment. In the late 1950s, the Air Force began developing the partially reusable X-20 Dinosaur. The Air Force collaborated with NASA on the Dinosaur and began training 6 pilots in June 1961. The rising costs of development and the prioritization of Project Gemini led to the cancellation of the Dinosaur program in December 1963. In addition to the Dinosaur, the Air Force had conducted a study in 1957 to test the feasibility of reusable boosters. This became the basis for the Aerospace Plane, a fully reusable spacecraft that was never developed beyond the initial design phase in 1962-1963. Beginning in the early 1950s, NASA and the Air Force collaborated on developing lifting bodies to test aircraft that primarily generated lift from their fuselages instead of wings, and tested the NASA M2F1, Northrop M2F2, Northrop M2F3, Northrop HL10, Martin Marietta X-24, and the Martin Marietta X-24B. The program tested aerodynamic characteristics that would later be incorporated in design of the Space Shuttle, including unpowered landing from a high altitude and speed. Design process, edit. Main article, Space Shuttle Design Process. On the 24th of September, 1966, as the Apollo space program neared its design completion, NASA and the Air Force released a joint study concluding that a new vehicle was required to satisfy their respective future demands and that a partially reusable system would be the most cost-effective solution. The head of the NASA Office of Manned Space Flight, George Mueller, announced the plan for a reusable shuttle on the 10th of August, 1968. NASA issued a request for proposal, RFP, for designs of the Integral Launch and Reentry Vehicle, ILRV, on the 30th of October, 1968. Rather than award a contract based upon initial proposals, NASA announced a phased approach for the Space Shuttle contracting and development. Phase A was a request for studies completed by competing aerospace companies. Phase B was a competition between 2 contractors for a specific contract. Phase C involved designing the details of the spacecraft components, and Phase D was the production of the spacecraft. In December 1968, NASA created the Space Shuttle Task Group to determine the optimal design for a reusable spacecraft, and issued study contracts to General Dynamics, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, and North American Rockwell. In July 1969, the Space Shuttle Task Group issued a report that determined the shuttle would support short-duration crewed missions and space station, as well as the capabilities to launch, service, and retrieve satellites. The report also created 3 classes of a future reusable shuttle. Class I would have a reusable orbiter mounted on expendable boosters. Class II would use multiple expendable rocket engines and a single propellant tank, stage and a half, and Class III would have both a reusable orbiter and a reusable booster. In September 1969, the Space Task Group, under the leadership of Vice President Spiro Agnew, issued a report calling for the development of a space shuttle to bring people and cargo to low Earth orbit, LEO, as well as a space tug for transfers between orbits and the Moon, and a reusable nuclear upper stage for deep space travel. After the release of the Space Shuttle Task Group report, many aerospace engineers favored the Class 3, fully reusable design because of perceived savings in hardware costs. Max Fagert, a NASA engineer who had worked to design the Mercury capsule, patented a design for a two-stage fully recoverable system with a straight-winged orbiter mounted on a larger straight-winged booster. The Air Force Flight Dynamics Laboratory argued that a straight-wing design would not be able to withstand the high thermal and aerodynamic stresses during reentry, and would not provide the required cross-range capability. Additionally, the Air Force required a larger payload capacity than Fagert's design allowed. In January 1971, NASA and Air Force leadership decided that a reusable delta-wing orbiter mounted on an expendable propellant tank would be the optimal design for the Space Shuttle. After they established the need for a reusable, heavy-lift spacecraft, NASA and the Air Force determined the design requirements of their respective services. The Air Force expected to use the Space Shuttle to launch large satellites, and required it to be capable of lifting 29,000 kilograms, 65,000 pounds, to an eastward LEO or 18,000 kilograms, 40,000 pounds, into a polar orbit. The satellite designs also required that the Space Shuttle have a 4.6 by 18 m, 15 by 60 feet, payload bay. NASA evaluated the F-1 and J-2 engines from the Saturn rockets, and determined that they were insufficient for the requirements of the Space Shuttle. In July 1971, it issued a contract to Rocketdyne to begin development on the RS-25 engine. NASA reviewed 29 potential designs for the Space Shuttle and determined that a design with two side boosters should be used, and the boosters should be reusable to reduce costs. NASA and the Air Force elected to use solid propellant boosters because of the lower costs and the ease of refurbishing them for reuse after they landed in the ocean. In January 1972, President Richard Nixon approved the shuttle, and NASA decided on its final design in March. The development of the Space Shuttle main engine, SSME, remained the responsibility of Rocketdyne, and the contract was issued in July 1971, and updated SSME specifications were submitted to Rocketdyne in that April. That August, NASA awarded the contract to build the orbiter to North American Rockwell. In August 1973, the external tank contract to Martin Marietta, and in November the solid rocket booster contract to Morton Thiokol. Development, edit. On the 4th of June, 1974, Rockwell began construction on the first orbiter, of 101, dubbed Constitution, later to be renamed Enterprise. Enterprise was designed as a test vehicle, and did not include engines or heat shielding. Construction was completed on the 17th of September, 1976, and Enterprise was moved to the Edwards Air Force Base to begin testing. Rockwell constructed the main propulsion test article, MPTA 098, which was a structural truss mounted to the ET with 3 RS-25 engines attached. It was tested at the National Space Technology Laboratory, NSTL, to ensure that the engines could safely run through the launch profile. Rockwell conducted mechanical and thermal stress tests on structural test article, STA 099, to determine the effects of aerodynamic and thermal stresses during launch and reentry. The beginning of the development of the RS-25 Space Shuttle main engine was delayed for 9 months while Pratt & Whitney challenged the contract that had been issued to Rocketdyne. The first engine was completed in March 1975, after issues with developing the first throttleable, reusable engine. During engine testing, the RS-25 experienced multiple nozzle failures, as well as broken turbine blades. Despite the problems during testing, NASA ordered the 9 RS-25 engines needed for its 3 orbiters under construction in May 1978. NASA experienced significant delays in the development of the Space Shuttle's thermal protection system. Previous NASA spacecraft had used ablative heat shields, but those could not be reused. NASA chose to use ceramic tiles for thermal protection, as the shuttle could then be constructed of lightweight aluminum, and the tiles could be individually replaced as needed. Construction began on Columbia on the 27th of March, 1975, and it was delivered to the KSC on the 25th of March, 1979. At the time of its arrival at the KSC, Columbia still had 6,000 of its 30,000 tiles remaining to be installed. However, many of the tiles that had been originally installed had to be replaced, requiring 2 years of installation before Columbia could fly. On the 5th of January, 1979, NASA commissioned a second orbiter. Later that month, Rockwell began converting STA-099 to F-099, later named Challenger. On the 29th of January, 1979, NASA ordered 2 additional orbiters, of 103 and of 104, which were named Discovery and Atlantis. Construction of 105, later named Endeavour, began in February 1982, but NASA decided to limit the Space Shuttle fleet to 4 orbiters in 1983. After the loss of Challenger, NASA resumed production of Endeavour in September 1987. Testing, edit. After it arrived at Edwards AFB, Enterprise underwent flight testing with the shuttle carrier aircraft, a Boeing 747 that had been modified to carry the orbiter. In February 1977, Enterprise began the approach and landing tests, ALT, and underwent captive flights, where it remained attached to the shuttle carrier aircraft for the duration of the flight. On the 12th of August, 1977, Enterprise conducted its first glide test, where it detached from the shuttle carrier aircraft and landed at Edwards AFB. After 4 additional flights, Enterprise was moved to the Marshall Space Flight Center, MSFC, on the 13th of March, 1978. Enterprise underwent shake tests in the mated vertical ground vibration test, where it was attached to an external tank and solid rocket boosters, and underwent vibrations to simulate the stresses of launch. In April 1979, Enterprise was taken to the KSC, where it was attached to an external tank and solid rocket boosters, and moved to LC-39. Once installed at the launch pad, the Space Shuttle was used to verify the proper positioning of the launch complex hardware. Enterprise was taken back to California in August 1979, and later served in the development of the SLC-6 at Vandenberg AFB in 1984. On the 24th of November 1980, Columbia was mated with its external tank and solid rocket boosters, and was moved to LC-39 on the 29th of December. The first Space Shuttle mission, STS-1, would be the first time NASA performed a crewed first flight of a spacecraft. On the 12th of April 1981, the Space Shuttle launched for the first time, and was piloted by John Young and Robert Crippen. During the 2-day mission, Young and Crippen tested equipment on board the shuttle, and found several of the ceramic tiles had fallen off the top side of the Columbia. NASA coordinated with the Air Force to use satellites to image the underside of Columbia, and determined there was no damage. Columbia re-entered the atmosphere and landed at Edwards AFB on the 14th of April. NASA conducted 3 additional test flights with Columbia in 1981 and 1982. On the 4th of July 1982, STS-4, flown by Ken Mattingly and Henry Hartsfield, landed on a concrete runway at Edwards AFB. President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy met the crew and delivered a speech. After STS-4, NASA declared its Space Transportation System, STS, operational. Description, edit. The Space Shuttle was the first operational orbital spacecraft designed for reuse. Each Space Shuttle orbiter was designed for a projected lifespan of 100 launches or 10 years of operational life, although this was later extended. At launch, it consisted of the orbiter, which contained the crew and payload, the external tank, ET, and the 2 solid rocket boosters, SRBs. Responsibility for the shuttle components was spread among multiple NASA field centers. The KSC was responsible for launch, landing, and turnaround operations for equatorial orbits, the only orbit profile actually used in the program. The U.S. Air Force at the Vandenberg Air Force Base was responsible for launch, landing, and turnaround operations for polar orbits, though this was never used. The Johnson Space Center, JSC, served as the central point for all shuttle operations, and the MSFC was responsible for the main engines, external tank, and solid rocket boosters. The John C. Stennis Space Center handled main engine testing, and the Goddard Space Flight Center managed the global tracking network. Orbiter, edit. Main article, Space Shuttle Orbiter. Shuttle launch profiles. From left, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. The orbiter had design elements and capabilities of both a rocket and an aircraft to allow it to launch vertically and then land as a glider. Its 3-part fuselage provided support for the crew compartment, cargo bay, flight surfaces, and engines. The rear of the orbiter contained the Space Shuttle main engines, SSME, which provided thrust during launch, as well as the Orbital Maneuvering System, OMS, which allowed the orbiter to achieve, alter, and exit its orbit once in space. Its double delta wings were 18 m, 60 feet, long, and were swept 81 degrees at the inner leading edge and 45 degrees at the outer leading edge. Each wing had an inboard and outboard 11 to provide flight control during reentry, along with a flap located between the wings, below the engines to control pitch. The orbiter's vertical stabilizer was swept backwards at 45 degrees and contained a rudder that could split to act as a speed brake. The vertical stabilizer also contained a 2-part drag parachute system to slow the orbiter after landing. The orbiter used retractable landing gear with a nose landing gear and 2 main landing gear, each containing 2 tires. The main landing gear contained 2 brake assemblies each, and the nose landing gear contained an electro-hydraulic steering mechanism. Crew, edit. The Space Shuttle crew varied per mission. They underwent rigorous testing and training to meet the qualification requirements for their roles. The crew was divided into 3 categories: pilots, mission specialists, and payload specialists. Pilots were further divided into 2 roles: Space Shuttle commanders and Space Shuttle pilots. The test flights only had 2 members each, the commander and pilot, who were both qualified pilots that could fly and land the orbiter. The on-orbit operations, such as experiments, payload deployment, and EVAs, were conducted primarily by the mission specialists who were specifically trained for their intended missions and systems. Early in the Space Shuttle program, NASA flew with payload specialists, who were typically systems specialists who worked for the company paying for the payload's deployment or operations. The final payload specialist, Gregory B. Jarvis, flew on STS-51L, and future non-pilots were designated as mission specialists. An astronaut flew as a crewed spaceflight engineer on both STS-51C and STS-51J to serve as a military representative for a National Reconnaissance Office payload. A space shuttle crew typically had 7 astronauts, with STS-61A flying with 8. Crew compartment, edit. The crew compartment comprised 3 decks and was the pressurized, habitable area on all space shuttle missions. The flight deck consisted of 2 seats for the commander and pilot, as well as an additional 2 to 4 seats for crew members. The middeck was located below the flight deck and was where the galley and crew bunks were set up, as well as 3 or 4 crew member seats. The middeck contained the airlock, which could support 2 astronauts on an extravehicular activity, EVA, as well as access to pressurized research modules. An equipment bay was below the middeck, which stored environmental control and waste management systems. On the first 4 shuttle missions, astronauts wore modified U.S. Air Force high-altitude full-pressure suits, which included a full-pressure helmet during ascent and descent. From the 5th flight, STS-5, until the loss of Challenger, the crew wore one-piece light blue Nomex flight suits and partial pressure helmets. After the Challenger disaster, the crew members wore the launch entry suit, LES, a partial pressure version of the high-altitude pressure suits with a helmet. In 1994, the LES was replaced by the full-pressure Advanced Crew Escape Suit, ACES, which improved the safety of the astronauts in an emergency situation. Columbia originally had modified SR-7100 ejection seats installed for the alt and first 4 missions, but these were disabled after STS-4 and removed after STS-9. The flight deck was the top level of the crew compartment and contained the flight controls for the orbiter. The commander sat in the front left seat, and the pilot sat in the front right seat, with 2 to 4 additional seats set up for additional crew members. The instrument panels contained over 2,100 displays and controls, and the commander and pilot were both equipped with a heads-up display, HUD, and a rotational hand controller, RHC, to gimbal the engines during powered flight and fly the orbiter during unpowered flight. Both seats also had rudder controls, to allow rudder movement in flight and nose wheel steering on the ground. The orbiter vehicles were originally installed with the multifunction CRT display system, MCDS, to display and control flight information. The MCDS displayed the flight information at the commander and pilot seats, as well as at the aft seating location, and also controlled the data on the HUD. In 1998, Atlantis was upgraded with the multifunction electronic display system, MEDS, which was a glass cockpit upgrade to the flight instruments that replaced the 8 MCDS display units with 11 multifunction colored digital screens. MEDS was flown for the first time in May 2000 on STS-101, and the other orbiter vehicles were upgraded to it. The aft section of the flight deck contained windows looking into the payload bay, as well as an RHC to control the remote manipulator system during cargo operations. Additionally, the aft flight deck had monitors for a closed-circuit television to view the cargo bay. The middeck contained the crew equipment storage, sleeping area, galley, medical equipment, and hygiene stations for the crew. The crew used modular lockers to store equipment that could be scaled depending on their needs, as well as permanently installed floor compartments. The middeck contained a port-side hatch that the crew used for entry and exit while on Earth. Airlock, edit. The airlock is a structure installed to allow movement between 2 spaces with different gas components, conditions, or pressures. Continuing on the middeck structure, each orbiter was originally installed with an internal airlock in the middeck. The internal airlock was installed as an external airlock in the payload bay on Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour to improve docking with Mir and the ISS, along with the orbiter docking system. The airlock module can be fitted in the mid-bay, or connected to it but in the payload bay. With an internal cylindrical volume of 1.60 meters, 5 feet 3 inches, diameter and 2.11 meters, 6 feet 11 inches, in length, it can hold 2 suited astronauts. It has 2 D-shaped hatchways 1.02 m, 40 in,